Alright, at this point we have discussed all of the properties for shadows that are included in a light, but there are a few more controls you need to be aware of that are actually found inside your quality settings. Now to show these off, I am going to hit play, and we've got this one great big long wall down here that runs the entire length of our level and gives us this nice big long shadow, which will be perfect for what I want to demonstrate. So I'm going to hop up on top of this box, and then you can see this shadow receding way off into the distance, so I'll go ahead and hit Control, Shift, P. Now, these properties I'm talking about are found underneath our quality settings, so we go under Edit, Project Settings, and jump down to Quality. Now, along with all of your quality settings, basically what you've got here is a breakdown of all of the different presets you could be playing your game in, and so everything that we're going to discuss here can be established for each one of the presets, meaning you can establish your shadow resolution, your shadow cascades and whatnot for fastest. You can establish them for fast, simple, good, beautiful, and fantastic, all on individual levels if you so desire. But what we want to do here is show you what each one of these are and how you can utilize them.
Right. Now the very first one that you'll see is shadows. Basically, this is going to determine, depending on what preset you're doing, if you're going to disable shadows altogether, whether or not you're only going to allow hard shadows, or if you'll allow both hard and soft shadows.
And in terms of fantastic, it makes sense to allow hard and soft shadows together. And down from here, we have shadow resolution. Now, we already kind of talked about this earlier on in the video about the shadow resolution within the light. The setting that you actually set inside the light will override this, but you can, as you saw earlier, tell your light to just follow the quality settings you set up here. So we have low resolution shadows, medium, and high. Now currently we won't see a result from changing this because at the moment we have established this setting in the sunlight itself, but if I was to jump over to the sun temporarily, take our shadow resolution and just set this to use quality settings, now if I go back underneath our project settings and down into quality, as I make changes, also you have to make sure our editor quality is currently set to fantastic, meaning only the changes that we make to the fantastic preset will be applied and visible. So now I can take my shadow resolution, I can set that to low, as you see here, I can set it to medium, and I can set it to high. Now down from here we have shadow cascades, but I'm going to skip this because shadow cascades is dependent on your shadow distance. We're going to jump down to this. Now what is the shadow distance?
Well, shadow distance works in two different ways. The second way is with light maps, and we'll come back to that in a future video set.
That was awesome. So it works in two ways. The second way...
Yep. Well, you know, I want to continue on with the first way.
I understand. I understand.
The way we're going to discuss it now is how it works with dynamic lights.
Okay.
Now, the shadow distance is the point in the distance at which shadows will be calculated or not calculated. So as we bring in this number...
Let's bring it down to like 10, just for sake of example.
All right, so within the distance from our camera to 10 meters out, we will actually see real-time shadows. Beyond that, we do not have shadows.
Right.
Now, those shadows aren't just being faded out. They just don't exist. They're not being calculated at all.
Well, we can confirm that. If we go up to stats and turn that on, take a look at the draw calls here, currently at 96, and as I increase the shadow distance, you'll see those steadily continue to climb upward as we take into account more and more objects into our shadow calculation. Also notice something else. Because our shadow resolution is being spread over a larger area, you're going to notice the resolution of the overall shadow diminishing as we increase this value.
And if you look really, really closely, you can see several different stages of the shadows getting higher and lower res as it's getting further away from the camera. That actually has to deal with the shadow cascades.
So what are shadow cascades?
Well, shadow cascades are the number of different shadow maps that are being calculated from the camera's position to your shadow distance. We can actually adjust this, and there's actually three different settings. We have no cascades, which means it is using a single shadow texture for the entire distance of our shadow.
So everything within the shadow distance is being calculated with a single shadow map.
Right. Now, two cascades means it's doing two different shadow maps. We have a near shadow map, which goes from our camera to about halfway out, and then a second one that's a lower res one.
Actually, when you say halfway out, what do you mean exactly?
From, if you were to take the distance from the camera's position to our shadow distance.
That's right.
And divide it in half, The first half would be a higher res shadow map that's being calculated, and from the halfway point out to the shadow distance is a lower res one.
Right.
And the reason why it's lower res is because it's further away from the camera, you're really not going to notice it. So there's no point in spending all the time calculating a high res map.
Now we also have 4 cascades.
Right. 4 cascades is actually 4 different shadow maps that are spaced out across the distance, with the lowest res going from about halfway between your camera all the way out to the shadow distance, and then as it comes closer it divides that distance in half again, with the closest one being the highest res, and each cascade out becomes lower and lower res all the way out.
Right. So I mean, in this case, like if we were to set this to say 100 even, from about 50 on would be our lowest resolution. Now half the distance from 50 back to the player, which is what, 25? Mm-hmm. From 50 down to 25 would be our second, and from 25 halfway to that would be our third, and then from there back to the camera would be our fourth. So we'd have a total of 4 separate shadow maps, each with steadily higher resolutions as we get closer to the player.
Right, and it's an optimization trick. But something you notice when we're flipping through the shadow cascades, look at our draw calls right now with 4 cascades. We're at 146 draw calls. If we go down to 2, we drop down to 126, and if we drop down to no cascades, we're down to 118. So while we are getting better looking shadows, we're incurring a penalty because we're doing multiple shadow calculations. So this is another thing that you might want to take into consideration when you're determining how you want to do your shadow cascades as well as your shadow distance.
That's true, and I don't want to throw this out here and compound things too much, but do remember that right now we're looking in the quality settings, and that all of these settings we're talking about exist for each one of these presets. So we're not really discussing setting this up for fastest versus setting it up for fast, simple, and so on. We're just getting the point of the properties across. But if you are fine-tuning across all of your different presets, remember to keep that in mind. I mean, generally your fantastic setting is going to be your highest quality setting, and remember that. You wouldn't want to go through and just be heavy-handed and set all of these to no cascades unless you really knew that for no reason whatsoever would a player ever need to see high-quality shadows.
Right. And with the way the Unity builds out your games, you actually have the ability, if you turn on setting resolutions, to also specify the quality that you want your game to run at. So if you're allowing that, then your player is going to be able to choose the quality that he wants. So you want to have a range of different settings. Now, if you're building out for the web player, you're not allowing them to make this change at playtime, you're going to have to take into consideration that the fact that they're only going to be able to play at the settings that you have predetermined. So you have to take into consideration and make sure that the settings that you choose are going to play on the widest range of platforms that you're picking.
Now, earlier on, we kind of pulled away and started talking about shadow cascades. You said there were 2 different ways in which shadow distance would operate, and we only talked about the first one. What was the second one?
Well, the second one deals with light mapping. What happens is if you bake out light maps for your scene using the Beast rendering or baking engine, you will have a light map that will take place and fill in the light maps and shadows beyond your shadow distance out. So what ends up happening is from your camera to your shadow distance is a real-time shadow. Mm-hmm. And if you look right now where the shadow ends, it kind of softens and blends out.
Let's bring it a little closer.
Right. So it's actually going to blend from real-time shadows out to your light maps. Because we don't have any light maps here, you're not seeing any shadows. But if we had baked out light maps, beyond that shadow distance is going to blend into your shadow map or your light map.
Right, and that's something that we will be discussing once we get into light mapping, but because you did mention there were 2 different ways, I did want to make sure it at least got touched on here.
Right, and we'll demonstrate that when we get to the section on light mappings, exactly what it does, and we'll mess with the sliders and you'll see exactly how that works.
All right, so that's a rundown of the various shadow settings you have access to in your quality settings. Remember, you would be tweaking these for each one of the various presets that you have, provided you wanted to give your player access to those presets. That will wrap things up for this discussion. Thanks for watching.